Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have an extremely special guest. We were discussing earlier whether we should be using the word doctor or not, but I will begin by introducing Dr. Joseph Devlin. He is a neuroscientist with 20 plus years of experience conducting research in language, narrative, audience engagement, and consumer neuroscience. He is currently a professor of neuroscience at the College of London. How are you doing today?
I'm really good. Thank you very much, Gautam. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited for today's conversation. I think, I was briefly talking about it earlier, but I think the brain is so fascinating, especially when it comes to talking about education. And I think it's so interesting how we can talk about policy, pedagogy, and so on and so forth, but we sometimes miss the fact that the brain is what kind of conducts all of learning. And because you have to first define what is learning, what is intelligence. We use these words willy-nilly all over the education space, but to get the perspective of a neuroscientist and I think really helps found a basis for these definitions. So I guess we're going to start with the hard-hitting question, which is in a lot of your work, what have you found to be for you the definition of intelligence?
That is one of the hard-hitting questions. Good to start at the top. For me, intelligence isn't just one thing. Intelligence is really a set of interrelated systems that allow you to respond in a broad and flexible way to a variety of problems, right?
Hmm.
So historically, intelligence was thought of as like general intelligence. You've got this one thing that underlies all of our abilities, and you're smart or you're not, or there's a scale. And I just don't think that's true. I think that you can be smart in some areas and less smart in others, or more or less gifted. So I tend to think of it more in terms of we have these different types of intelligence. Some of them are cognitive, problem solving and reasoning. Some of them are sort of language based, how verbally fluent you are, and some of it's more emotional, like in social, how able we are to empathize with others and also recognize our own kind of emotional states and how that affects what we're doing. I personally find that one's really important in my like really close relationships, like my wife and my kids. A lot of times it's more about how I'm doing than how they're doing, that where we get into situations where that's tricky. So I think intelligence is this sort of set of interrelated skills that allow us to function flexibly in a really dynamic world.
Hmm. What is your thoughts on what the IQ test then measures? Because that doesn't measure these other aspects that you're talking about.
Yeah, so traditionally, IQ tests are to measure what they call the G factor, which is this general intelligence. And that is supposed to be this kind of underlying core concept that's common to all of them. So this was an old idea from like the turn of the 20th century. There's a guy named Charles Spearman who focused on this. And the idea was that you could get this one measurement that told you broadly how you performed in general. And then on top of that, people had sort of specific abilities. And the truth of the matter is, it was supposed to be innate. It wasn't something you could train or learn or get better at. And I just think that all of those things have proven to be false. Now, in fairness, there's a guy who was doing this, and I think it was the 1920s, or maybe it was even earlier than that. So we're 100 years on, and you would expect our thinking to evolve over time. Um, but it seems to be the case that intelligence can be measured multiple ways. You can definitely measure emotional intelligence different than cognitive intelligence, even maybe different than social and linguistic. Um, and those are not necessarily particularly well linked, but also they're not stuck. It's not like you're born with it, and by the time you're able to do the tests, that's what you got for the rest of your life. It seems like those things can actually change as your brain develops, as your social circumstances change. There was some really cool work that Kathy Price did maybe about 10 years ago, where she was looking at adolescents in school, so 13-year-olds, basically, and some of the brain changes related to developing into 16, 17-year-olds. And what she found was that she did sort of these kind of standardized IQ tests with them at those 2 points in time, as well as brain scans with them at those times. And of course, the kids changed over time, but the traditional explanation is, oh yeah, well, the test is noisy and people aren't always You catch them on a good day, you catch them on a bad day. It doesn't mean that they've really changed. But what she
Hmm.
found was that the structure of their brains changed in consistent ways. The people who went up on like spatial reasoning all had brain changes that were associated with spatial processing. And the kids who went up on like
Wow.
linguistic were more showing these changes in parts of their brain that are really important for language. So she then said, well, is it the case that these are just noise, or is it the case that there's something structurally changing as people develop? And what's important to them is, of course, individual, and that's affecting their brains in kind of predictable fashion. And I think that's really interesting. It suggests that what's going on is more than you're born with something and that's what you've got, take it or leave it.
Hmm. When you talk about these changes, what does change in the brain even look like?
Well, in that experiment, they were looking at what they call gray matter density. So with MRI scans, they were getting structural scans of the brain. So that is to say, a really detailed picture of the anatomy. So not like how it's being used, but just what it looks like. Gray matter and white matter being the brain cells and the connections between the brain cells. And what they found was that across these kids as they grew up and developed, there were systematic changes to the amount of gray matter in certain parts of the brain that were related to this changes in their IQ scores over time. And they refer to that as gray matter density because nobody has a really great detailed knowledge of what gray matter density means as measured by an MRI scanner. It's one of the things that's still an open question, but it turns out that it was one of the indications in the early 2000s that your brain wasn't sort of set by the end of adolescence, right? So there were some great
Hmm.
studies that showed that people learning new skills actually physically changed their brain. And the first one that really got all the attention was London taxi drivers. And you may have heard about this, but this was this funky study that Eleanor McGuire did where London taxi drivers have to learn the crazy streets of London, and they're just a spaghetti mess, right? And so it's a brutal kind of memory task, and they learn it over a course of years. And what she found was that parts of their brain, part of their hippocampus, which is important for spatial navigation, was physically denser, larger than people who didn't know what's called the knowledge, the streets of
Wow.
London. And it raised the question is like, well, do you just have a bigger hippocampus and you're more likely to become a taxi driver? Or does learning to be a taxi driver change your brain? And in a series of follow-up studies, she found that it was actually the learning process that physically changed the brain. And that was one of the early indications that, throughout the entire lifespan, there's no point where you're not capable of learning new information and it physically changing brain structure.
That's fascinating. So one of the things you talked about there was size. Does that mean if, because the brain, I don't think physically all of it grows, does that mean there's only a cap on how, if one part grows, the other ones shrink? How does that work?
That's exactly right. So if you're going to increase density in one area, you tend to decrease density in surrounding areas.
Wow.
So yeah, so it's a kind of take from Peter to pay Paul. Your head, after I can't remember what the age is, it's probably something young, like 9 or 10. It's not like your brain size overall changes. It's developed into its sort of adult size, even if your body has not. Um, but if you're going to see these kind of microstructure changes in one area that are associated with learning a new skill and new knowledge or whatever, then you also see reductions in other areas. And it's interesting because that sounds like it should be bad, right? Like, oh no, what have I lost? But it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case that you're losing things. It could just be that other parts are capable of performing more efficiently as you grow up, as you develop, and therefore there's no specific cost to it. It's not like if this area has shrunk in sort of cell density, it can no longer fulfill its basic function. It could still do that. It might just do it a little bit more efficiently as you become more skilled and knowledgeable.
Hmm. Even as you were talking, I had a thought go through my mind. I realized I got so excited by the first question of talking about intelligence. I completely forgot to ask you questions about yourself because I do want to know, like, someone who's interested in the brain, I feel like has had to have a pretty interesting story to have that be their thing. All the people I know who ended up being fascinated by the brain or studying it have very, very interesting stories that became their thing of fascination. Because in a lot of ways, it kind of drives our entire existence. I mean, I think it all starts from and maybe even ends at the brain. And so, how did you get to this point? How did you find your love for the brain?
It was kind of a crazy route, actually. When I was a kid, I was a big sci-fi fan. I say that I'm still a big sci-fi fan, but I loved the idea of artificial intelligence, and this was, like in the 70s and 80s, where AI was not what it is today. But I ended up doing a PhD in artificial intelligence in some of the precursor to what we now call deep learning. And at the time, it was really unsatisfying. I felt like AI was a total misnomer. The artificial was incredibly dominant. And what I wanted was to be able to talk to computers or robots or something like that. That was my sci-fi thinking. So at the end of my PhD, I thought, well, look, the AI side's not really working. Maybe I should learn something about how actual intelligence works. And clearly, I need to learn something about the brain to do that. And at the time, some of these new brain scanning methods like positron emission tomography and functional magnetic resonance were just kind of getting going. And I thought, this is great. Now we have some of these non-invasive tools to look at how brains are functioning in people without taking people apart and cutting holes in them and things like that. So I thought, great, I'm going to go do a postdoc in London, where I'm going to learn a little bit about brains and brain imaging, and eventually I'll take that back to my AI and computation, because once I understand how the brain functions a little bit better, I'll be able to do better artificial models. And then, 26 years have passed. And I feel like I never went back to AI, but AI has kind of come back to me, in the sense that when GPT came out, and I had sort of followed GPT-1 and GPT-2 and was just not impressed. But when ChatGPT was launched, and all of a sudden you could literally, I'm going to say talk to it, but I meant type. Now you can talk to it. But you could have like a conversation with an AI. That was a crazy moment for me, because I thought, like, well, this is what I wanted in 1995 when I was doing my PhD. And it just had to wait 30 years that I didn't didn't plan on. And in that time, I got really fascinated with brains, and I've just keep thinking there's so much more to learn. And I have so many questions that I've never really fallen out of love with it. I just think it's an exciting time that maybe it's time now to try to marry the two, although I'm now more on the neuroscience and I'm struggling to catch up on the AI side.
Hmm. And I think I'm really curious to hear your opinion on this. So when you think about what it means to be Joseph, what it means to be yourself, do you sometimes just feel like you're a meat suit carrying around your brain, or do you feel like there's this deeper interconnected relationship between your body and mind?
Well, I definitely frequently feel like a meat puppet, but I feel like the me in me is a combination of brain and body. Like, I'm not willing to separate out the rest of me from the brain, because I feel like it's the totality that is Joe. And I understand that my experiences and my emotions and my ability to understand the world and all of the rest of that is largely sitting in my head. But it's not entirely. I mean, when I experience an emotion, I experience it physically as well as sort of mentally, right? My heart races, I might be angry or sad or happy, but all of those things are part of the experience. And those are the things that make up me. And I feel like if I had a different meat suit on, I would be a different person. Like, my brain isn't this little abstract center of Jonas that you could plug and play into a different body, for instance. The whole
Hmm.
thing is me.
So what are your thoughts on when, let's say, an emotion arises and you say your heartbeat rises? Is that your brain telling your heart rate to rise, or is that your heart rate rising, which then informs the brain, hey, you're feeling this emotion? How does that work?
I actually think that it's the latter. I think that what's happening is there's something in the world that you've experienced, or some trigger that's caused what I'm going to describe as an emotional reaction, but not necessarily emotion. So that is to say, your heart rate to rise, to breathe faster, whatever the case may be. And you then have this sense of proprioception, this sense of what your body is doing, that your brain interprets as an emotional state. And the emotion itself, that you label it, is literally just a label. And that's why it's really
Hmm.
hard to get people to necessarily agree on what emotion they're experiencing, even when they're describing something really similar. And some of them are easy, right? I mean, if we're all smiling, then we're probably all happy to say we're happy. Um, but when you get with some of the more negative emotions, anger, despair, fear, etc., those those things are, I think, more culturally determined and experientially determined. So I remember the example I always like to use with this is, do you remember back when in the original Trump presidency, when they were showing images of immigrant children in cages, right?
Hmm.
Those were emotionally evocative images. But when you asked people what emotion they were experiencing, it varied wildly. Some people were angry, some people were sad, some people were, despairing over it, some people were shocked. Um, but what was interesting is if you measured what was happening to their body, they were actually having very similar responses. They were having a
Wow.
very strong physiological response that their brain is then putting into terms that they can make most sense out of.
Hmm. Which brings up this really fascinating point, which is like, where did we learn what word to associate, right? I mean, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. I think that song is a great place to where like kids are able to kind of connect a word to like, that's what this means. Smiling means this. But as you get older, you start, I think this all the time with especially love, where anytime I say or I hear someone say, I love you, my first question is like, what does that really mean though? I mean, like, because maybe we watched different movies when we were kids to have different definitions, but what do you think influences the way we attribute words to these feelings the most?
Yeah, that's a really interesting and hard question to answer. And I think that it's obviously your own personal firsthand experience of the situations that you've been in. When you're a kid, a lot of that's from your parents, the way they use the words. And of course, those things are going to make a disproportionate influence because they were kind of first in, right? Like those were the times when you've heard these words from your mom and your dad or whatever your, siblings, etc. That those people have a big influence just because it happened early in your life. As you grow up, you're influenced much more by your peers and your friends and people around you. And of course, then you start to refine them to fit what you want. So you may have like your best friend at school who's using a word in a slightly different sense. They may be much more willing to say that they love someone than like in my house, that wasn't a word that we used a lot. It was used very special. Whereas I had friends when I went to university who were much more willing to say, "Oh no, man, I love you, man." And for me, it was kind of disconcerting, but also slightly inspiring because that they would say that meant something to me, probably meant more to me than it meant to them when they were saying it. But it made me think, oh, right, that's a word that is more flexible than maybe the way I think about using it. And then I was much more conscious about, well, how do I apply this? How do I use it in relationships with, partners, but also friends and special friends and things like that. So I think it's really interesting because I think that by the time you start becoming an adolescent to an adult, you have a much more conscious ability to interject the way you want to use these terms. But a lot of that's shaping things that were set down when you were just a little kid, right? As you were learning the terms to begin with.
Yeah. And kind of connecting it to what's actually happening physiologically, I think is something that allows you to understand just like what you're feeling a little better. I mean, this is something I'm personally just really curious about. I read this book recently called A Thousand Splendid Suns, and I don't know if you've ever read it. Beautiful book, and it evoked a lot of emotion with me. And one thing I realized when I was reading that book is that I don't feel a lot of emotions often. Or what I mean by that is I think in some ways I try to, minimize the amount that I feel, especially some feelings over another. So in the same way we were talking earlier about intelligence and developing different forms, and when we talk about someone who's able to like feel a wide range of emotions, what does that really look like in the brain and what experiences cause that to happen?
So there's a part of your brain called the amygdala, which is a set of nuclei or cell bodies sitting in the middle part of your temporal lobe, sort of on towards the center. And the amygdala seems to be really important in processing emotions. It's not the only part of your brain that's involved, but it's an important aspect. And what's fascinating is it seems to be really important for almost the intensity of the emotion, but not necessarily the direction. So whether you hate something or you love something, you still get a strong amygdala response. So just from that, you can't tell whether it was good or bad. And the amygdala drives part of the brain called the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which is just way too much of a mouthful. So everybody just calls it the HPA. And the HPA is what drives the physiological response, changes your heart rate, changes your breathing, changes cortisol levels in your brain, things like that. So one of the things that seems to be really important is this sort of what's normally called arousal level, the strength of the emotional reaction. The valence, which is to say whether it's positive or negative, seems to be almost kind of orthogonal to that. It's like 90 degrees separate. And it's been very hard to identify specific bits of the brain that are clearly involved in which is positive and which is negative. So Lisa Feldman Barrett is a neuroscientist who talks an awful lot about emotions and has an amazing book about like how emotions are made. Describes those two dimensions as the center of emotional experience. And then, the question is, well, which brain regions are involved in representing valence? Because there are certain parts of the body that are important with that. And even dumb things, like if it's positive, you're much more likely to smile. And if you're terrified, you're less likely to smile. That's not 100%. There are, people who smile for mean reasons. But nonetheless, these differences are things that are measurable in the brain, certainly on one dimension. And then the other aspect of this is how you kind of control those emotions. So part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex, which sits more or less in the front of your brain, is really important for sort of regulating your amygdala. So our ability to take an emotional
Mm,
reaction and then either downplay it or upregulate it is something that we can control to some extent. And there are
mm,
different aspects to it. Like if you were, say, a firefighter, running into a burning building is presumably a pretty terrifying experience. But the more you do it, the more you experience it, the more you've trained for it, you're better able to regulate that sort of amygdala response. And as a result, you downregulate some of the cortisol that plays out in your brain that allows you to think more clearly in those situations and
mm,
respond frankly, in a more safe environment. Whereas in contrast, if you're being chased by, some sort of mad dog, um, you don't probably need to think a lot. You probably just need to get the heck out. So you need that strong response, and you don't necessarily want to suppress it. You probably just need to flee, or if you're a fighter,
mm.
I don't know, take on the dog if that's the way you think. So it's really interesting. There's a lot of aspects to the way the brain processes emotion, and people's ability to regulate emotion is part of what I would say is part of their emotional intelligence. So they recognize what's happening in them, and then they can sort of control it or suppress it or enhance it depending on the circumstances. What's the right thing to do?
So an emotion would be defined as the physiological response. Is that it?
For me, an emotion is the label that somebody puts on their physiological
Mm,
response.
got
But
it.
the underlying biological truth is that bodily response, to my mind. That's a controversial perspective, but I think it's growing in popularity within our community anyway.
Mm. You brought up something interesting there in the examples that you gave, which is the example of the firefighter where, after they go into a burning building enough, they're able to like, control their fear so that they can kind of think about what they need to do in that situation. Is that not also similarly the case for the dog situation where someone who might be a little bit more like, okay, this is what I need to do, might actually be better than someone who's like stricken with fear? So I guess my question is what are some of those situations where actually enhancing your emotion might be a benefit rather than does it seem to be that it's always a benefit to kind of control it?
I think it depends on the person a little bit. So one of the things that you hear with like professional fighters, boxers, and mixed martial arts people is they vary a lot in terms of their experience of the emotions. So they all say, when I go into the ring, when I go into the cage, my heart is racing, I'm terrified. But for some people, they feed on that. That is energy. So the way they perceive it and label it as this is excitement. For others, it's kind of fear and dread and anxiety. So in the excitement case, you want to upregulate it because it's going to give you energy to, face your opponent who's trying to knock you unconscious or whatever the case may be. Versus someone who's actually dreading it, they want to try to control and suppress it as much as they can because they want to be clear-headed and they're not benefiting from the emotion, the
Mm,
physiological response to the same way. So I think part of it depends a little bit on your perception. And I would imagine that's true for performers of all levels. I mean, if you're a football player or you're a musician, it's the same thing. And part of it is the way you perceive that reaction depends on how you then want what you want to do with it.
mm. I mean, I think this all ties in so deeply to education as a whole because understanding from the start, what you kind of highlighted was just this idea of all these different forms of intelligences. And then you added this other beautiful piece, which is it gives a lot of hope, I think, compared to a lot of the other literature that you see, where it's like, if you do badly on the third grade math and reading, then, you're just destined for failure. To kind of like have this perspective that your brain can develop based on what it needs at any given time. And so the more you try something or practice something, it just grows. And it also develops its ability to perform that particular task. I guess my question for you then is learning simply the process of that change happening? Is that what learning looks like? And to what extent, sorry, just to add another piece to that, to what extent is memory key in that learning process?
Yeah. So there's a couple aspects there. I think that learning is that repeated practice and acquisition of either new knowledge or skills, depending on the type of learning that you're doing. And memory memory and learning are things that, from a neuroscience perspective, are kind of the same thing, but they're different types of learning and memory, and they play out slightly differently in different parts of the brain. So if you are learning to play tennis, then you're fundamentally doing a physical activity, although it's not limited to that, right? As you get better, you then start thinking about strategy and tactics on the court and how your opponent's performing and whether or not they've got tells and all those kind of things. Whereas if you're learning physics, then mostly it's not a physical thing, right? You're not doing stuff, or maybe you're doing some experiments, but you're trying to understand some of these underlying physical laws and how they play out, and like what is gravity and what does that mean for the way planets move and how we can jump on Earth and things like that. So the different types of knowledge are represented in your brain in different ways. But the process is largely similar. That is to say that the brain cells, the neurons, start changing the connections between them. So they strengthen connections between cells that tend to fire at the same time, and they weaken connections between cells that are sort of not working at the same time. So it's the same thing that we were talking about before. You give some, you lose some, right? You never just get straight changes. And depending on the brain system that's involved, you can do this relatively rapidly. So there's a part of your brain called the hippocampus that's incredibly good at making these very quick changes, like one-shot things. You and I haven't met before today. Nonetheless, I'm going to walk away with a memory of this experience and who you are and our conversation. All of that's very, very fast. And the hippocampus is important for laying down those new memories. But I won't be able to keep them forever unless the hippocampus then does slower training of the rest of my neocortex. So by reiterating this, reliving the experience, watching the pod, talking to others about it, all of those kind of things, I will actually integrate of today's experiences into my long-term memory, which is not really what the hippocampus is good at. It's good at short and fast, not long-term. Whereas in contrast, if I was learning to play tennis, other parts of my brain, like the cerebellum and some of the subcortical structures, would be paying an awful lot of attention to my muscle movements and trying to automate that. And of course, it's a long, hard process. Like, I'm a really bad tennis player. But I was just reading a book called Mastery by Arturo Hernandez, and it's about the process of learning new skills. And Arturo does a beautiful job, and he's obviously an avid tennis player. So there's chapters on tennis because that he goes into in great depth, and I've been enjoying reading it very much, which is why that was at the front of my mind.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there is something I think when you were bringing up that tennis example, I was thinking about what one of the benefits of education has been for me. It's that the ability to see that there is some thinking that goes behind every single action. So, for example, like if you were to watch a tennis player, like you said, at the very beginning learning stages, it's simply, okay, can I physically learn the skills to do this? Playing basketball, can I dribble? But the second you get decent enough, all of a sudden now it becomes a lot more intellectual than purely physical. And there's so much, can I handle the fear? Can I handle the pressure? Can I handle, can I figure out what to do in a moment to moment second by, thinking, but also using my body? It's this beautiful kind of relationship between thinking and acting. And I think that's kind of the thing that education really, I don't know, trains.
I agree. I think that ability to recognize patterns. So you stop treating it as kind of individual components and you start seeing it as a connected whole. And probably up until the very highest levels of mastery, you never stop. Like you will constantly see more and more connections as you become more and more educated, skilled, experienced in whatever art or sport or field of knowledge you're working on.
Hmm. So at this point, there is no flow to this conversation. I'm all these things that I've just been so curious about. I'm just throwing at your way and hoping, I feel like I'm learning already so much. So the next thing so we read this phenomenal book recently called Three Body Problem. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's
Yeah, the science fiction novel, I
yes,
can't pronounce the author's name properly. Do you know how to say it?
it's I think Nixon. I don't know how to say it, but
Okay. Yeah, I
yeah.
know the book you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes, but phenomenal book. But one of the aspects that they talk about it in there is like the limits of human consciousness. And so like the alien species, for example, I'm sorry if this is a slight spoiler for anyone,
Spoilers.
but it's one of their powers is the ability to communicate without words. And so they kind of talk about the benefits that come from that, the fact that lying is no longer a concept. It changes like how their societies themselves function. I think because as humans, we don't often get to interact with other conscious beings, and maybe I'm wrong in that word. Maybe other animals are conscious. I'm not sure. Are they? They are, right? No, I don't know how that
It's a
works.
really controversial stance. I would have said yes. I think some animals probably are conscious, but I'm with, who knows?
Okay, yeah. So I guess my question is because we don't get to see other beings who we may consider to be more conscious than us, we can sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that this is the highest that we've reached the maximum capacity for consciousness. I think one thing to understand and that helps is to understand where we are capped. Like what are our limits that our brains can do? Then you can understand, what would it even you can imagine what it would be like if we were capable of more. One example of this is our limits of feeling empathy. That's something I think about all the time of like, I can't, even though I'm talking to you, I can't feel your emotions at all. Imagine if we were able to step into a room and immediately pick up the emotions of everyone within a 100-foot radius of us. That would, make us act and live completely differently. But what are some of the other ways that you feel that the human capacity for like whatever is just capped?
Well, I think we have some interesting caps on learning. So one of the things that I find fascinating is that although learning happens throughout the entire lifespan and will never stop, there are times and places where learning is harder than others. So I feel like as I've grown up, people have always told me at different points in my life, oh, you should know this. And somehow it never hits until I actually get there. So I remember like, as a kid growing up, my parents would tell me, things about being a kid and when you're a little bit older, you won't think this way. And such, you just always think, oh, whatever, mom, dad, I don't know. But then when I had my own children, I remember thinking, oh man, that's what mom and dad were telling me too late. And but that kind of thing has happened throughout my whole life. And I feel like one of the things I constantly wonder is what are the things that people are telling me right now in my life that I somehow can't hear, can't learn, and it's going to be another 10 years before I think, That was it. That's exactly what you were telling me. I had to live it myself. And I think that's a fundamental limit of our learning. I mean, the idea is
Hmm.
that for things that you just don't know, it's really hard to learn it. It takes quite a lot of effort. Things that you actually are reasonably good at, you can start learning much faster because you've kind of got a foundation to build on. Um, so why is it that we're so bad at learning from the experience of others? Why does it have to be personal experience that fundamentally makes these breakthroughs? That seems like a
Hmm.
fundamental kind of flaw in what's otherwise a good social species.
Hmm. Really well said. I mean, I wonder if there is, it's something I think a lot about when I think about religious people. I think there is some high level of faith and trust that okay, whatever my book is saying or whatever my religion is saying is true and that is the right thing to do. And so this particular thing that you're saying, I feel like for some people that I meet actually are really good at learning just from because someone else said it. I mean, I have this conversation with my parents all the time because they grew up culturally in a very different place and I see it in their own behaviors as well, where when their parents or their elders would say something, I mean, they would take it. They wouldn't question it really. I mean, truly. And it's something that's always fascinated me because I've never been like that. I mean, like what you said, I will not believe in something until it bites me, right? Like, oh, that snake is dangerous. No, it's not. Look. And then only when I get bitten, I'm like, okay, all right, maybe the snake is dangerous. But there seems to be a difference among humans in that as well. And I think a lot of it has to do with our relationship to science and like what we believe is, like how much do we trust the words of another? And so I've never thought about this also as another form of intelligence because you can't learn everything through personal experience. You can only have so much personal experience. You can't experience it all. So then the question becomes like, how do you filter which voices you want to listen to versus not? Is there a name for this type of intelligence?
Not that I'm aware of. That's such a great point that this varies a lot, and I tend to be much more on the empirical side of things, which probably means I have to walk through walls to learn that walls are hard.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's such a fascinating thing that some people are willing to take the words of others and take them on. I mean, one way that people can learn about other people without actually experiencing them directly is through stories, right? I mean, you mentioned thousand something suns. I can't remember it. It's the
Thousand Splendid Suns.
Blended Suns. That's right. Which is the Khalid Hosseini. Is that
Yes, yes.
right? And I remember reading The Kite Runner, which I think was possibly his first book.
Yes.
And I've never been to Afghanistan. I didn't really know anything about Afghan culture. But that book kind of just put me in that experience, in the shoes of this young child growing up in a country that was very volatile and confused and made it real in a way that all of the CNN, Fox, etc. reporting never did, right? There wasn't a human element to it. It was just sort of some geopolitical stories. And I think that stories are amazing for that because you can walk in someone else's shoes and learn from that just by immersing yourself in their stories, whether it's reading or audiobooks or watching a movie. I don't think that part really matters as much, but it gives you an opportunity to engage in someone else's perspective taking that would otherwise be hard to do. And I think that that's one of the very cool, unique things about being a person is that we have this opportunity and it's just up to us which stories we want to engage in, what we are interested in, and what we take from them.
Hmm. And I'm curious if, you talked a little bit, I am remembering some of the parts of the brain that you talked about, but you talked about the amygdala is the one that kind of shows the strength of an emotion or like makes you feel. Is that also going to be tied into some extent to the hippocampus, which does the memories, or they interplay off each other a lot?
They most definitely do, because the
Hmm.
emotional response helps shape the memory response. And interestingly, the memory helps change the emotion. So sometimes when I talk to corporate people, they have these ideas of they always talk about funnels for some reason. And they like the idea that, maybe when you see an ad, if you attend to it, that's the first stage. And then if it engages your emotions, that's the second stage. And then it leaves a memory trace, that's the third stage. And then finally, maybe it changes the way you act on something. Maybe you go out and buy something, or maybe you click on a website and do something. And it's such a very linear perspective, which totally is not the way what's happening in the brain at all. I mean, the sort of attention, emotion, and memory very much interact with one another and shape each other. And to the point, it's really notable to my mind that the hippocampus and the amygdala are physically next to each other. They have really close interconnections between them. And I think that that sort of speaks to how important it is that they're constantly interacting with one another. So yeah, I totally agree.
Hmm. When it comes to education, I mean, I think it's honestly really unfortunate. I think the words like intelligent and smart are really weaponized against students. I think for the 1% of students who leave school feeling like they're intelligent or smart, the other 99 feel like they aren't. And I think it's terribly an injustice in so many ways. And, I teach a lot and I hear so many parents and kids you can tell their beliefs on knowledge and learning just from a few things that they say. Like I hear parents all the time being like, my kid is so good at math. He actually just got an A last semester, which the other side of that is if they didn't do well in math, then all of a sudden they're bad at math, right? It doesn't say anything about the class or the rigor of the course or how much they learned over the year. We're not talking about any of that. All we're talking about is whether they got an A or not, which is in some ways an arbitrary metric. So because you're also a professor and you do teach and you are in that space as well, what are your thoughts on this word smart? What does that really even mean?
Yeah, it's interesting because you've got this kind of state trait difference happening. And to be honest, like when somebody gets a mark, an A on a test or a course or something, that's something about their current state, right? Which, as you say, depends on how interested they were, how good the teaching was, what their life circumstances were. It's really not something fundamental about who they are as a person. And that's more a trait. But what we do is we confuse those two, and we do this all the time. But in education, it happens a lot where we say, yeah, this is a really bright kid because they did very well in my course, for instance. And yeah, I mean, when you're being positive to somebody, that's possibly an encouraging thing, but the implicit other side is the kids who didn't they don't meet
Hmm.
this. They're somehow their traits are they're not that smart. And that's really unfair to those people because sometimes if you hear it enough, you start to believe it.
Yeah.
I had a PhD student when I was in Oxford who had not gone to Oxford or Cambridge. So she had come from University of Manchester, which is a great university in the UK, but it's not Cambridge and Oxford. And there's this kind of I don't know. I think there's this mystique around Oxbridge, and a lot of the kids who do uni at Cambridge or Oxford believe in it, and therefore it gets repeated. And there's that state aspect. It's like, yeah, you're there. That doesn't mean that you are somehow special as a result. But my student Helen, who was amazing, was uh, believed. I mean, I remember her coming to me one day and saying, I don't belong here. I'm not smart like these people. And I was like, Helen, you are absolutely smart like a lot of the people around you. There's an awful lot of smart people here. You just haven't heard it said to you as much as some of these people have heard it said to them. And that's, the downside of this, this practice in education of praising people for being smart because they did well on a something. And I think we could do a lot better by saying, hey, you did great on this test. Well done. Or, amazing job in my class. You really earned your A or whatever. But that's about what they did, what they earned, what their experience was. It isn't about who they are. Um,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
it doesn't have any implications, good or bad, for who they are. Because who am I to judge who someone that's not my role. I'm there to help them learn, and I can be impressed by how well they do or not, but that's nothing about who they are as a person.
Hmm. I'm writing that down because I just think it's an important message to keep telling yourself as an educator, because I think sometimes you want to do that. You want to be, sometimes there's a drive where when you have a student who does so well that you want to, there, I think it's a very conscious practice to be like, I am only seeing a sliver of who anyone is, right? I mean, your friends, I mean, this is, I think, I was having a beautiful conversation with a friend pretty much about this, where it's like, even though you're my best friend, I need to remember that I only get to witness probably 0.5% of your life, even if we talk 2 hours a day, right? I mean, there's 99.5% of your day that I have no idea what's happening. And this is even larger with students that you might see, 3 times a week or whatever. Like you don't really know what else is happening. So to be able to feel like because of your one class, you have the ability to actually push a label on a person or to judge them for who they are is terrible. I think it's terribly unfortunate for a lot of students who feel less than.
It's a really unfortunate practice, and it's something that I think as educators we need to be aware of. And it's something that's under our control. There's no reason not to praise people for doing well on whatever it is that they've done, but it does have to be about their accomplishments or their actions, not about who they are as a person.
Mm.
And I think as
So,
parents, it's a risk too when you're raising your kids, right? It's the difference between doing something naughty and being a naughty person. It's like, yeah,
mm,
everybody does naughty things. That's just part of being a little human being or even a big human being. But
mm,
that doesn't mean that you're a bad person by any stretch of the imagination. But if you hear it a lot, you might start to come to believe it because you hear it from people that you like and trust. And that's a risk.
talk about the action, not the person. Yeah. So, one thing I'm curious about is because when I look back to my schooling, I was never taught about the brain. I mean, it was never something that was, I don't remember really even in biology or chemistry. I mean, we never talked about the brain. So I'm curious what you feel like has been the personal impact on the way you lead your life, the way your relationships are, the way you view the world, and the way you view yourself that is inspired by all that you learn about the brain on a day-to-day basis.
It's funny because I do think that it's made a big difference to me, and I sort of wish that there had been a little bit in school, at least. I mean, we in biology or something. One of the things that I find really interesting is people vary in a lot of different dimensions, and I think that the more you interact with people, you see, oh no, people are different in different ways. But it's still, we all have this expectation that the world is as we understand it, right? It's kind of this naive realism. Because, of course, as you said, the only person you ever experience 100% of their life is you. And we mostly think, oh, it's probably representative, probably other people are in the same boat. But that's not really true in many ways. I mean, there are things that are and the things that aren't. And one of the things that's different is that people do have different traits and abilities, and they bring their sort of different intrinsic biases. So one of the things that I've really noticed, particularly in the last 10 years, that has been shaped by my thinking about the brain is around political dialogue and why it's so hard, right? So, a lot of when I was growing up, I felt like there was more scope for dialogue where you disagreed. You might be a Democrat, you might be a Republican, you might be something else, but you could talk about these issues and it wasn't quite as polarized as the current situation. And I don't think that's limited to the US by any stretch at the moment. Um, but as I grew up and it's become more and more polarized, I've discovered there's a lot of good reasons why people might tend towards one end of the political spectrum or the other that are actually kind of intrinsic to who you are. So whether or not you're more sort of traditionally focused and think about the importance of traditional structures and why we've done things the way we always have versus maybe more seeking new experiences and these dimensions help shape our kind of implicit political biases. And knowing that has helped me speak to people who have different political bents than me. Like I can reframe what I'm saying in terms that might be more meaningful to someone who comes from a very different perspective. It takes a lot of effort. I have to think about it. But I only started to be able to do this when I realized, no, this is kind of intrinsic to the variability in brains. And I know some of these dimensions that we vary in, and it's not that that person's being sort of a knothead or focusing on something that's not important when I'm talking about X, or I'm being a knothead for not listening to what they're saying. It's that we're coming at it with these different biases that are shaped by our biology. And it's up to me, if I want to try to overcome that, to be able to think about it in those terms and relate it to them in terms that are sensible, that make sense to what they can hear, what they want to hear. Um, and then we can have more, in-depth discussions. So even at really basic levels like that, sitting in the pub talking to friends about politics, I feel like some of that's changed simply by learning a little bit more about how our brains function and why we act the way we act.
Hmm. I've been I've been finally writing kind of a thesis on my definition of what a good education is. And I've been focusing it around this concept of perspective, where you mentioned earlier, and I think was a really key point, which is the ability to recognize how varied we are from each other, not in the sense of like we're very similar in many, many ways, but we're different also in the things that we experience. And often our approach to things as if they aren't sometimes really causes this dissonance. But I'm realizing now there's so many levels to this. Even if we all had, because the way I was thinking about it is we're all different because of our experiences. And even if we had the exact same brain, our experiences in some way would have been so diverse that we would have been different. Now I'm realizing that not only are our experiences different, but also our brains themselves are different. And so the way we experience those experiences are also so different from each other. So it's not that if we had both experienced the same things, we'd be very similar. That's actually not true. And so there are so many levels to how we are different that I feel like I've never even conceptualized because I didn't really understand how, different our brains could be.
I think it's a really interesting topic because clearly there's an enormous amount of commonality that we all share, right? We all have the same basic wetware with our brains and our bodies, but we're also aware that there are important differences between people, and I think we can see that physically with people. He's taller than she is, and she's stronger than he is, or whatever the case may be. Um, but I don't think we think about that so much with the brain. But all of those subtleties are there too, and they're just not visible because you can't see brains. All you can see is the behaviors that people bring. And you're right. I think it's absolutely shaped by our experiences, and it's also shaped by some of the underlying biology. And that interplay is such a fascinating kind of dynamic area to understand. People always talk about it in terms of nature versus nurture. And I think that's a false dichotomy. It's nature and nurture, which means, oh man, it's now just become twice as complicated, or possibly,
Sure.
complicated squared, maybe.
Yeah. So I guess my final question for you, which I think would be a nice way to knot this up, is in our desire to, let's say, be more empathetic with our students or with teachers to understand how different we are. I think one approach, as we said earlier, is to understand, what is the background that they come from. That's a great way to put yourself into someone's shoes. But another phenomenal way is to also try to understand in what ways our brains can be different. So what are some of the ways you feel like people, because you talked about, being able to connect with people across the political aisle, what are some of the ways in which the differences in our brains can lead to differences in the way we act and think?
There are a number of personality traits that are important for education. I mean, one is extroversion, introversion, which is a common kind of dimension that people talk about, but it really makes a difference to the way students interact. And sometimes there's this sort of very simplistic idea that it's more engaging if you have students interacting, talking, discussing things. And there's a certain amount of truth to that, but it's very much focused students who are more extroverted to begin with. For somebody who finds that slightly aversive or more scary, that's not a good thing because you've put them outside of their comfort zone, right? So I think that that's something that we have to recognize, that it's not a clear, like, everybody's going to benefit from this. People vary in terms of that. Openness to new experience is another one. There are some people who are intrinsically more curious than others. Everybody's curious. We all start out that way, and we will all die still curious, right? The whole life, but they vary in terms of how curious they are. And in education, we maybe assume, of course, everybody should be super curious because that's what we're here for. We want to help share the world with them in some sense. but it does vary, and it varies in systematic ways that you can understand if you think about, no, different people are at different points in this trajectory, um, and that's something we should build into our teaching. But there's risk aversion is another one that's really
Mm.
fundamental. Some people, and this, I think we think about this in who goes bungee jumping or jumps out of a plane, and how you do financial decision making. Those are the two areas where we often think about risk. And look, I'm not jumping or jump out of a plane under probably any circumstance. I just don't have that in me. Whereas some people absolutely adore it. And that's all well and good, but in the classroom, it matters too. When you give somebody an assignment where they have to do a presentation to the class, that is an anxiety inducing experience for almost everybody. And some people who are less risk adverse are going to stand up and rock out. And there are others who are much more risk averse who see this as potential disaster, right? So I think that these kind of dimensions are really important because there isn't a one size fits all best educational strategy here. The best educational strategy is one that's at least at some level personalized to the student who's in the
Mm-hmm.
learning process. And it's our job as educators to do as much as we can. Like if you're teaching a class of 1,000 people, odds are you're not going to know them. I mean, there are
Yeah.
like intro psych classes at like Ohio
Oh,
State that'll have
wow.
1,000 kids in them.
Yeah.
And that's super hard. But normally then they break it down into much smaller groups. And at that level, it's our responsibility to try to understand the individuals and what would be most helpful, most engaging for them, and then tailor the content to do it that way. Because it's not a one size fits all proposition.
Yeah. You know, something that would be fascinating is if we actually later like came up with a list of somehow of all these different dualities. Because I think an example we had touched on earlier is this idea that, someone who takes the word of another, right? I mean, there are benefits to that and there's also cons to that. It's not like one is good. And same with being risk averse. Like there are situations where someone who's risk averse would have thought through something a lot more, would have really come up with good reasons to not do something versus someone who isn't. So if you're able to maybe have like 20 of these maybe little, and you take the time to learn your students, you can kind of maybe place everyone as an instructor where your students kind of are, and then you can kind of use each other's strengths to build this. I think it would be beautiful to have maybe 10 or 20 of these kind of things. I think, do you know if that exists already?
Well, amusingly, the example that I know of exists in the corporate world for that. So there's a company called Oxford Risk that does financial consulting in the UK, and they have gamified that. So for people who invest through them, they have this website which you can opt into or not as you choose, and you play these games that give you where you rank on those dimensions. So it's not normally binary so much as some gradual thing. And they use that to try to optimize their communications to you. So if you've provided that kind of information, then when they write to you about like investment opportunities or how you need to change your retirement scheme, or I don't know, I'm not good with finances. Then they try to tailor it to your profile so that it's most effective. Like the content of the message doesn't change, but the way they do it is designed to be tailored. And of course, if you choose not to engage with that, you'll still get the same content, but it may or may not fit your particular style of listening to it. So I think that kind of thing is possible, and it can even be done at scale by leveraging some of the remarkable advances in sort of large language models at this point. But for educators, you don't want to do it at scale. You'd want to do it on a sort of more personal basis where you actually get to know your students and try to understand what resonates best with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I would be really interested. Thank you for sharing that. I would be interested in developing something like that over the time, just I think to have at least a model for myself, I think, to understand all the ways in which people can differ and how that influences the way they view the world. But, I wanted to say thank you so much for this conversation. I had a lovely time talking to you, and I would definitely love to have you back in the future.
Well, thank you so much. I've had a great time too. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you very much for the invitation to come speak with you today.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.